You know, when Plato writes his Republic and devotes Book 10, as I'm sure most of you know, to an argument, in effect banishing the poets from the ideal republic, part of the argument is that poets are terrible imitators. They imitate reality as badly as they possibly can. They're 3 times removed from the ideal forms of objects in reality. They're a hopeless mess. They get everything wrong. They think that a stick refracted in the water is therefore a crooked stick. They're subject to every conceivable kind of illusion, not to be trusted, and Socrates calls them liars. Okay, now when Aristotle writes his Poetics, he does so, and this is true, and rewards scrutiny if one thinks carefully about the Poetics. He does so very consciously in refutation of Plato's arguments in the Republic. And one, perhaps the keystone of this refutation is simply this. Plato says poets imitate badly. Aristotle says this is a category mistake because poets don't imitate reality. Poets don't imitate, says Aristotle, things as they are. They imitate things as they should be. In other words, the business of poets is to organize, to bring form to bear on the messiness of reality. And in so doing, to construct not an alternate reality in the sense that it has nothing to do with the real world, that is to say, it doesn't mention the real world, or it somehow or another invents, human beings made out of chocolate or something like that, but idealizes the elements existing in the real world such that its object is something other than reality as such. And this is really the origin of formalism. Aristotle is considered the ancestor of the varying sorts of thought about form, and it's this move that he makes in the Poetics that engenders this possibility. Now, turning to your sheet. In the early modern period, the poet and courtier Sir Philip Sidney wrote an elegant, really wonderfully written defense of poetry in one edition called The Apology for Poesy. And in this edition, he develops, while actually a fervent admirer of Plato, he nevertheless develops this idea of Aristotle with remarkable rhetorical ingenuity, and I think very impressively lays out the case that Aristotle first makes. First passage on your sheet. Sidney's talking about the various kinds of discourse: divinity, hymnody, science, philosophy, history. In other words, all the ways in which you can contribute to human betterment, human welfare. And he says all but one of them, there is a serving science. That is to say, it is subservient to the natural world. Its importance is that it refers to that world. First sentence of your passage. There is no art but one, delivered to mankind, that hath not the works of nature for his principal object. This, by the way, although it's not exactly a work of nature, this, by the way, is why even that which is incontestably better than secular poetry, hymnody, and also divine knowledge, theology, that's why even these fields, which are the supreme fields, are also serving sciences. They are subservient to an idea that they have to express, which is the idea of God, right? And God is real. Nobody, I mean, we're sort of, there's no sense that we're making God up in this kind of discourse. Sidney is a devoutly religious person, and there's no semblance of doubt in his attitude. And yet he is saying something very special about the poet, who is somewhere in between divinity and the other sorts of discourse with which poetry is traditionally in rivalry: science, philosophy, and history. And he says this is what's unique about poetry. Only the poet, disdaining to be tied to any such subjection, in other words, to things as they are, disdaining to be tied to any such subjection, lifted up with the vigor of his own invention, doth grow in effect another nature. He nothing affirms, and therefore never lieth. In other words, Plato is wrong. The poet is not a liar because he's not talking about anything that's verifiable or falsifiable. He is simply talking about the parameters of the world he has brought into being. Sidney thinks of it as a kind of magic. He invokes, for example, the pseudoscience of alchemy. The poet, he says, ranges freely within the zodiac of his own wit. He also invokes the pseudoscience, I meant to say astrology. He also invokes the pseudoscience of alchemy when he says that the poet inhabits a brazen world. And of this brazen world, he makes a golden world. In other words, poetry is transformational. In representing not things as they are, but things as they should be, it transforms reality. All right, so this is an argument which in outline, once again, justifies the idea of literature as form, as that which brings form to bear on the chaos and messiness of the real. Now, I don't mean to say things just stood as Sidney said they were until you get to Kant. A great deal happens. But an aspect of Kant's famous Copernican revolution in the history of philosophy is his ideas about aesthetics and the beautiful, and about the special faculty that he believes has to do with and mediates our aesthetic understanding of things, a faculty which he calls the judgment. So that in the Critique of Judgment, 1790, he outlines a philosophy of the beautiful and of the means whereby the judgment makes judgments of the beautiful. He does a great deal else in it, but I'm isolating this strand, which is what's relevant to what we're talking about. In many ways, Kant, without knowing anything about Sidney, nevertheless follows from Sidney, particularly in this, as you'll see. I'm going to look sort of with some care at these passages, so all will become clear, but particularly in this. Sidney, and I didn't exactly quote the passage in which Sidney does this, but I urged you to believe that he does. Sidney actually ranks poetry somewhere between divinity and the other sciences. In other words, poetry is not the supreme thing that a person can do. Sidney believed this so much, in fact, that when he knew himself to be dying, having been mortally wounded in a battle, he ordered that all of his own poems be burned. I mean, he had, from the standpoint of a devout person, he had no doubt that poetry was inferior to divinity. Now, in a way, that's what Kant's saying too. In the passages you'll read, you'll see that the point is not that art and the judgment of the beautiful is the supreme thing that humanity can be engaged with. The point is only that it has a special characteristic that nothing else has. That's the point that this whole tradition is trying to make. So this is the way Kant puts it, turning first to the second passage. The pleasant and the good both have a reference to the faculty of desire. The pleasant is the way in which our appetency, our sensuous faculty, which Kant calls the understanding, by the way, understands things. Things are either pleasant or unpleasant. The good, on the contrary, is the way in which our cognitive and moral faculty, which Kant calls the reason, understands things. Things are either to be approved of or not to be approved of. But in each case, as Kant argues, they have a reference to the faculty of desire. I want, I don't want, I approve, I disapprove. And they bring with them the former, that is to say, the pleasant, a satisfaction pathologically conditioned. The latter, a pure practical, purposeful satisfaction which is determined not merely by the representation of the object, that is to say, by the fact that the represented object exists for me, right? Not merely by the representation of the object, but also by the represented connection of the subject with the existence of the object. In other words, by the way in which I want it or don't want it, approve of it or don't approve of it. My subjectivity, in other words, determines my attitude toward it. Whereas what Kant is saying is that my attitude of that which simply stands before us as what is neither pleasant nor good, but is rather something else, doesn't exist for me. It exists in and for itself. The next passage. Taste is the faculty of judging of an object or a method of representing it by an entirely disinterested satisfaction or dissatisfaction. In other words, yeah, I still like it or don't like it, but my liking has nothing to do either with desire or with approval, moral, political, as the case may be. I just like it, or I just don't like it, according to principles that can be understood as arising from the faculty of judgment and not from the faculty of the understanding, which is appetitive, and the faculty of reason, which is moral.